Welcome to the Untangling Web3 podcast. Today, we'll be introducing my friend and social media influencer, Dr. Annie Zimmerman. So, Annie is a psychotherapist, writer, academic, and influencer. She started her life-changing insights from the therapy room on TikTok and Instagram as Your Pocket Therapist back in 2021. I have a lot of friends who actually know about this. I didn't know about it until a year ago, but it's everywhere, basically. Since then, she's built a community of hundreds of thousands of followers all across the world. And today we've got Annie on the show to discuss technology and mental health. And yeah, it's a bit different. We'll be talking about the implications of technology on mental health and what technology needs to be like in the future to actually address some of the concerns and maybe even improve on the current mental health situation. So without further ado, introducing Annie to the show. Let's kick this off.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to finally have you on. I think that, we started off as a pure tech podcast, and more we're kind of having to go into the realm of like where technology kind of makes a difference in different fields, different disciplines, normal people's lives. And when I asked you to come on this, your first reaction was like, no, I don't do Web3 and technology and all this kind of stuff. But that's exactly what we want because you've got so much experience in so many different ways. I think it's going to be so fascinating to have your insights on this stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, I think therapy and mental health is a very technophobic profession. Even though I am a Instagram influencer and I also work on Zoom, it's full of dinosaurs and mostly middle-aged women. So it's not super updated as other fields are. So it's going to be interesting to talk about how technology is impacted and where the future's going with it.
And you're at such like a unique kind of junction of so many things. So like you say, you're like the social media influencer. So that's the big whole like tech area there. And also you kind of going to talk about how technology is impacting society in a negative way and what you're seeing in like your day-to-day practice. But then there's also the option like, is technology going to help us? And I think that's kind of maybe one of the more hopeful, exciting areas. But we'll get onto that a bit later, hopefully, and kick off.
Yeah, and Annie, just before we get into that, I think this is good because we're probably both laymen in each other's area here, right? So you're the mental health professional, and you have this huge experience, and we know a little bit about Web3, but I think today is where the East will meet West on these two. So this is going to be really interesting for me as well. I feel like lots of us are much more aware of mental health as a topic than virtually ever before. It's spoken about a lot. I think from my perspective at least, the situation has improved from where it was maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago with this increased awareness, with more access potentially. But could you just give us a very brief kind of introduction to the field of mental health? So what does it actually mean to you, mental health, and what are the trends you've been seeing towards the mental health of society in general at the minute?
Yeah, I guess it's a really broad term, mental health, but my understanding is it's like your relationship to yourself, how you're feeling in yourself. I mean, it can impact physical health too. Mental health can feel really physical, but it's generally how you're feeling psychologically, your sense of identity, your sense of purpose, all of these things, as well as, symptoms that we might have like anxiety, depression, addiction, diagnoses, these kind of things. And in terms of trends in mental health at the moment, in the same way that there are trends in technology, there's also trends in mental health problems. So in the 60s, for example, or even earlier in the 20s, when Freud came about, mental health issues presented really differently. So women would have hysteria and would have all of this kind of like hysterical symptoms, and people would have a lot of physical problems where they would stop being able to feel their limbs, or they would suddenly go blind out of nowhere. And actually,
Yeah.
we see trends in mental health. So I think a few years ago, it was more anxiety and depression as being really, really common, which still a lot of people suffer with. But now it's kind of moving into ADHD and autism as being things that people are suddenly kind of resonating with and much more and seeing themselves in that. I guess ADHD is something really interesting to talk about in terms of technology because there's such a link. And I don't think technology is a great thing for people with ADHD who are trying to focus and motivate and things like that. So that's a big area. I think more generally, just in terms of what society is struggling with, I think loneliness is an epidemic, not
Mm.
just in old people, which is where it's traditionally talked about, but I think actually in young people more and more. You hear all these stats about 16-year-olds and 15-year-olds, and they're not getting involved with each other, they're not connecting. And why is that? What's going wrong when we're supposed to be kind of more socially connected than ever?
I'm glad you brought this up. Like, this is like what the kind of the promise was early on with like the boom of social media giants, right? It was connection, it's convenience, being able to sit in your room and speak to someone across the side, other side of the world near instantly and for free most of the time. And like when you think about that initially, you're like, wow, that's going to bring people together. We're going to understand each other more, be more peaceful, be more happy, connected. But it's the opposite, right? Like we're seeing more and more, we feel more isolated, more tribal, more extreme. And like you say, a lot of this is because of the social media giants potentially. I think a stat that I saw was that 32% of teenagers feel worse about their bodies after using social media like Instagram. And like you brought it up there, like the kind of the negative consequences for ADHD and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, let's jump into the technology bit. Like what do you think, like at a high level, is the role of technology in these trends?
Yeah, I mean, social media is like the obvious thing, and we should definitely talk about the pros and cons of that. But I think it starts even earlier now. Babies with iPads, kids playing video games instead of playing and being creative,
Mm,
not leaving the house. You see those maps of where kids used to go in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. And in the 80s, they were walking around the streets. In the 90s, they were going at least to the end of the road. Now they're not even leaving the front room, barely like
mm,
moving around into the garden, because technology is so addictive and compulsive. And you see babies with phones, like it's some weird instinct, like they just
mm,
want to look at the phone, like more than they even want to look at like a human's eyes. So it seems to like override some social instinct that makes us want to be more on screens than with people.
yeah.
And then you don't develop the skills, you don't develop the bonds, you don't develop everything that comes with being in like a community. And it can then feel harder to connect with people, and even scarier. And like then it's going out of your comfort zone just to say hello to someone in the street. And I think that is a scary place to be, because if you don't have community as a human, you don't feel safe. You like
Mm,
that's it's very like primitive, that if you feel like belonging to a group, then you're more likely to survive, because then you hunt together and
mm,
share berries and all of that. So if you're on the outside of a group, it's an existential threat, and it's terrifying, and your body's pumped with cortisol, and that's when you get loads of mental health problems. So I think a lack of connection is at the root of like so many issues, and that's when you start seeing addictions and anxiety. And then when you grow up, so that's just as a child, then you grow up, then you get on social media, and then that's supposed to
mm.
feel connecting, and it's supposed to be about relationships, and yet you feel more alone and less connected and more terrible about yourself.
Mm. Yeah, I'm glad you talked about like the addiction level of social media, because like it's something that I think is becoming more and more understood as a problem, but it wasn't early, like in the early conception of it. And I listened to a really interesting podcast. I'll try and link it after this, about like what we're going to do a detailed episode on this, about how AI actually impacted social media. So they basically like set up these social media apps, and they're like, okay, we want to get people, our whole kind of business model is to get people to use social media, to be as engaged and as on the app as possible. So they set up these kind of AI god algorithms to say optimize to make sure people are constantly clicking, constantly engaging. And what the AI apps kind of did by testing out on millions of humans what's the most addictive content, they basically found that greed and fear are two of the most addictive things. So the content that they push to people, to kids, to whatever, just triggers those two buttons. So that's why so much of the content is so addictive, because it really triggers those
Mm.
kind of like base survival instincts of those two things. I want something and I'm scared of something. And that is kind of why it's so polarizing, and has so many like negative consequences outside of the addiction. It also makes you more scared, makes you question, your neighbor, makes you more racist, whatever it is. Like it's such a problem for society, this stuff.
That's really horrible, isn't it? That the worse it is, the more we want to be on it. Like,
Yeah.
why do we? It's
Mm.
so counterintuitive. Like, why it's so addictive when it's so painful. I was also thinking that I heard a theory about why it's so addictive, especially TikTok and the like video reel apps, is because it works on the same way as a slot machine. So the reward
Mm,
is inconsistent. So on a slot machine, you lose, 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 and then win, and then your
mm,
dopamine spikes, and then you're like, oh, maybe I'll win again. But there's no
yeah.
pattern, and because it's random, you're more likely to not guess the pattern, and so you stay longer because your brain's trying to work out the pattern of
Mm,
when you get the
okay.
reward. And it's the same with TikTok, that it's like not that good video, not that good video. Oh, that one I like, spike my dopamine. But because it's so random, it keeps you on the app for like half an hour longer than all the other apps. Like their retention is amazing because they're like manipulating you in this way. It's so horrible. It's like you feel so powerless.
Mm.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I actually hadn't heard of that one before, but it's almost like hacking the gambler's fallacy, kind of, putting
Yeah,
more,
exactly.
investing more time, and then you find a golden nugget, and then you start investing more and more time in the rubbish content. That's really interesting. One I definitely hadn't thought of before. Another aspect of the rise of social media, because you mentioned the search for community. One interesting term that I've kind of seen popping up in the last couple of years is also around parasocial relationships, and my understanding is this is kind of when you have a content creator or somebody online, maybe a vlogger. The rise of YouTube was very much partly through vloggers, and people feeling like they have a genuine, almost like a friendship with these people. Do you think that's been a kind of healthy development? Do you think that's something that can cause harm, or do you think that kind of thing is a net good in how people ascribe value to the people when they're watching content creators online?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I definitely, like from personal experience, I watch some like YouTubers, and you, in a way, okay, so you're at home, you got an hour to spare, you put a YouTube video on of someone doing a daily vlog or whatever and talking at you, and you feel like you're connecting. You feel like a friend is talking to you, but ultimately you're not showing any of yourself. So it's like a really one-way
Mm,
relationship. But
exactly.
in a way, it's a kind of like celebrity culture. Like you get completely obsessed by people's lives, and they show you more and more, and like you want to know. At the same time, they can be quite a comfort, and maybe that's more nourishing than watching like a cartoon or something, because it is a real human and you might learn from them and connect with them and see yourself in them, and like in a way it can be connective. It's just that person doesn't know that you exist. I guess
Mm.
it's really easy to criticize social media as being antisocial, but there are actually lots of positive elements. Like there are amazing communities online that people can access and talk to, and you can have connection even if it's not face to face with the person. But it's at what cost? What does that take away from your actual human experiences?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with you. It's one of those things where you're right. It is way too easy to be critical, and I think people do. I have been guilty of this in the past as well, being too kind of default critical of it. I think like most things, right, in life, these things are quite good in at least small doses. And as you said, that these things can be a comfort. I know I've kind of felt this experience of a parasocial relationship with creators online, because maybe I use one to listen to in the background, and it's kind of nice. But then again, we've had these things with the radio as well, right? Like feeling like
Mm.
you might have a almost parasocial relationship with a radio presenter that you really like. So I think it's not necessarily new, but one of the things we've seen with technology is just the barrier to entry, or the variety of possible entry points for this experience has now massively increased. So yeah, I think it's an interesting area. And while we're talking about trends, I think one of the other big trends we've seen, specifically kind of related to mental health, is obviously the rise of kind of digital forms of therapy, right? So you have your better health, for example. They've seen huge increases. Do you have a take on that, and the kind of the new online digital delivery mechanism for therapeutic help when it comes to mental health?
I have lots of thoughts of it on it to varying degrees. I think BetterHelp is kind of, I guess, like Uber for therapists in a way. So you're still finding a real human. It's just giving a platform to do that. And so if the end result gets you to a human, then I'm really for it. I think
Mhm.
therapy is like, you know, when you do those quizzes that's like, how likely is your job to be replaced by AI or a robot?
I wonder where
Therapy
we're
is
going to come
like
onto this.
but therapy is like the like lowest percentile. Like even though there are now AI therapists, but that's questionable. Like for me, therapy is about human to human interaction, and there's like no replacement for that. I guess people use text therapists maybe, and like almost like a kind of like online chat assistant or whatever, but it's a therapist.
Mm.
Chat GPT even is giving therapy advice and things like that. I was really anti it because what works about therapy is you're being witnessed by another human, and you're being held by another human, and you bare your soul to them, and you tell them like all of the most terrible things about you or that have happened to you, and you
Mm.
cry and you get angry and you admit things, and another human says that's okay, like I'm still going to
Mm.
sit with you and you're acceptable,
Mhm.
and then you learn to accept yourself. And a any sort of technology just doesn't have that same gravitas and that same experience. But something that's really changed my mind on it recently is maybe still using technology as a tool to help alongside therapy, because my friend Matt, he, and I think this is the kind of people, the kind of client group that this could work for. He really struggles to have conversations with his girlfriend about his feelings. But he is like well aware that he needs to, and that that's really helpful for his relationship. And he absolutely hates being illogical. So he's designed this kind of chat GPT code where he just speaks aloud, free, all of his thoughts and rants kind of at chat GPT. And it spits out the key points that he's struggling with, and it turns them into what we call I feel statements. So instead of him saying to his girlfriend, "You didn't text me back and you're terrible," it's "I feel hurt when I don't hear from you," which is like known to be a better way of communicating because it's less attacking, and it's just he's just owning his feelings. And what I'm sure the code is like more developed than that. But when he has these conversations, he brings the script from ChatGPT and he literally reads aloud from it, because he's able it helps him to master his feelings. So instead of having a really heated conversation that actually isn't that productive, he really can take out the core of what he wants to say. And that made me think, actually, there is a place for that, for these kind of technological developments in therapy and in mental health that can help be a tool that people can feel like empowered to speak or have difficult conversations, and that they kind of lean on it as a crutch. And in the same way, on social media, therapy content is available 24/7. My therapist is only available to me once a week. So let's say I have a fight with my partner and I don't know why they've said that or whatever, I can go straight onto Google and start Googling, questions and answers, and go onto Instagram and watch something that resonates. And like it's something that's there for you all of the time. So I think that's what a therapist can't do. A therapist has boundaries and limitations and their own personal needs. So there's something to be said for something being available to you 24/7 that can make you feel supported or give you something in the moment. But that doesn't mean that it's the same as therapy. And I don't think that means it can replace therapy, but it's just another tool.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought this up so early on, because it's like such a kind of philosophical conversation around this stuff. It's like, what is it to be human? Do we need this kind of stuff? When you talk about the obvious things, we shouldn't be talking to robots about our feelings. There's something missing there, and the other person should be able to empathize. And then you kind of you talked about some of the pros that, like, it's so expensive sometimes, difficult to get therapy. Like, I think there's a stat which I'll pull out somewhere. It's like 56% of American adults with mental illnesses don't receive treatment because of cost and like lack of therapists. So it's like a lot of people that aren't getting this. And then you talked about, some of these apps just filling in the gap a little bit, like lowering the barrier to entry for, say, the more simple things, just to say, okay, well, these are your thoughts, maybe turn them into this kind of stuff. So I imagine like maybe it does fit quite well with this triage idea. Like, it's not going to solve all the problems, but it solves maybe the easier ones, like the filtering, say the bottom 20% or something like that. And then it gives the people that really need it the opportunity to, say, actually speak to a human. And you kind of get into the realm of like, well, then if it, say, we could create an Annie AI where someone could converse with Annie and they couldn't tell the difference. Like, it's online, obviously, but it's exactly like you, Annie. And they didn't know the difference. Like, what would be the difference to them in, say, chatting with that AI bot that they wouldn't get, say, chatting to you if the responses were exactly the same, do you think?
If the response was exactly the same?
Yeah.
And do they know it's AI? They think it's real?
It depends how legitimate we want this business to be.
It's interesting because actually, I find sometimes when I have sessions in person versus on Zoom, I personally don't like working on Zoom because there's something about being in the room with someone that is like so much more palpable and connecting. But sometimes I have a session on Zoom and the person will suddenly be able to cry or connect to something that they wouldn't have if I was sat with them. And there's something almost free. And I actually found this over lockdown. I was really reluctant to talk on Zoom, but I did so. And I was actually like, because I was safe in my own room with no one actually there, just my therapist on the screen. I suddenly found it much more freeing, and I was able to like really cry in front of her, which is something that I'd struggled to do. So I actually imagine if you had an AI therapist and you knew it was an AI therapist, you might tell them like everything. People might take a year to confess to me something really shameful, for example. Whereas if you knew it was AI and it wasn't a real person, you might feel really empowered and really free to just be really vulnerable and really open and show everything.
That's a good point. Maybe it's because like the lack of judgment or bias, or like, I mean, I wonder if Facebook could be storing all that data. You might be a bit less interested in it.
Yeah,
But
then it might make you paranoid that you're Yeah, exactly. It's not
Exactly.
that
A
safe.
question on this though is like, do you think that we lose something in ourselves when we kind of rely too heavily on, say the AI, for example, in that instance? Like, the kind of classic is, you said that you're using social media all the time. Like, I listen to podcasts. Like, I find it really hard now to not be doing something. Like, even if I'm walking down the street, I find it hard to not be listening to a podcast or not. I find the lack of stimulation quite concerning. And I worry that, like, the short-term gain of us being able to connect over the internet or be constantly have access to therapists online or ChatGPT to listen to all my problems. It's good in the short term, but in the long term, do we like develop a reliance that maybe isn't that healthy because of this?
Yeah, I think it's one of the main complaints that some of my patients are struggling with at the moment is phone addiction. It it's like everyone has been given the most addictive drug in their pocket. And beforehand, only a certain type of person in a certain like class and culture and everything would be able to access really addictive drugs. Now we all have one in our pocket and we have to fight that. So even if you weren't that susceptible to addiction and you're kind of like a reasonably mentally healthy person, you still have to fight your phone every single day, every minute of the day, which is quite a difficult thing to put onto people because then you feel like you're wrong or they're broken or something or weak or something because you end up spending most of your time on your phone. But actually, it's like we can't win this battle unless we all get rid of our phones somehow.
Yeah, I saw a really powerful video on this. This is always
On
the
your phone.
paradox of talking about it. I was probably watching it on my phone. Someone kind of spent 15 minutes just explaining, actually, people talk about social media being a problem. Actually, it's the phone, it's the device, it's the ever-present screen that takes your attention for 100 different reasons. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And as you're saying, the way it's affected our reward systems is the really scary thing, because it seems like it's confined to the phone, but then it starts bleeding out, especially in my experience, into the rest of my life. I find it harder to concentrate sometimes. And when you were talking about people starting from an early age, right, getting an iPad in front of them when they're just an infant, that is the thing that really scares me, because we're only just starting to understand the impact of this on our reward systems. Then if you go and accelerate that, Alec and I are young enough, luckily, to probably have only started experiencing this effect, in our early teens, I would say, with the rise of smartphones. But now if people are starting that when they're 3-4 years old, how much worse is the impact going to be? So I think that's one of the things that really scares me about it. I mean, do you think is there anything we can do, in your view, to curb that effect, right? And the impact, the downstream impacts we're seeing on our mental health generally? Because when I say impact on mental health as well, I think it's similar to what you were alluding to earlier, right? You were saying people are resonating with this idea of ADHD. I feel like a lot of people now say, "Oh, I've got a bit of ADHD. I'm on the spectrum in the ADHD sense because of this sense of not being able to concentrate, for example." So, do you think there's anything that we can do, maybe from a regulation perspective, or even if it's just practical things, to do with limiting our exposure to this reward hacking thing? What are your views on all that?
Yeah, I wish I had it hacked myself. I think I guess there's two things. There's like, yeah, there's just discipline and setting rules for yourself, like not taking your phone into the bedroom, for example, trying not to scroll just before you go to bed or like first thing when you wake up in the morning. Some sort of regulation for yourself around it, just to feel like you're
Mm.
the master of it rather than it's master of you. Um, but also on a deeper level, like any addiction, there's a reason for it. And what is it that you're avoiding in yourself by scrolling for hours? Often you might feel bored, you might feel lonely, you might feel anxious, and the phone is numbing you. So if we can start to let in those feelings and sit with them and get more comfortable with those things, then the need to numb it all with the scrolling hopefully goes. At the same time, I think like we because of technology and the advances, we just have so much time on our hands and it's not natural. Like we're supposed to be hunting and sleeping and surviving, and that's like the point of our lives. And now we just have so much time and we're living like doubly as long. Like what are we supposed to fill it with? So there's something about purpose and meaning and like what drives your day. If you have too much space in your day, you're going to fill it with something. So trying to find like healthy, productive purposes for your time.
Yeah. And I guess like a lot of us are inherently lazy. And when you're trying to fill your time with something, the first thing there is your mobile phone. You're like, oh, there's a whole world there. I'm going to go to that. Like, it's to Jack's point about, watching videos about addiction, phone addiction. Like, there's been a boom recently of mobile apps that are all about locking down your phone, which I find fascinating. There's like a whole industry now, which is like hundreds of millions of pounds and hundreds of millions of downloads of people just downloading phone apps to lock your phone away so you can't use your phone. Like, it's actually bonkers. So much so that I am trying to develop an app right now that does the exact same thing, because it's like I am there using my phone constantly for no reason. I know it's not good for me. My attention span is shrinking. I'm like, I need an app to lock this phone away. When really the answer probably is to just get rid of my phone or something like that. But I just can't do it. It's like the Ring in Lord of the Rings. Like, I don't want to get rid of the precious. Like, it's just, even though I know it's bad for me, but yeah, I don't know what we do about it. Like, it's really tricky. I think we're seeing a lot more regulation come into play. Like, I've seen in like some of the Nordic countries, they're banning, I think they just went up to 15 years old to use social media. Lots of schools are starting to ban phones in the school and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, I'm not really sure what it is. One thing that we've started to see is, a change to wearables. So rather than having this phone that is so addictive, takes all of your attention, I've seen people say that, there's Meta just released these smart glasses, which does a lot of your phone capabilities, but you just wear the glasses and you talk to an AI assistant. And I guess the theory is there, you're less like holding something completely engaged and distracted by something. It's more kind of complementary to your life, where you're seeing the world, and when you want to, you can engage on top of that with these smart glasses that kind of have like an Alexa style thing in there to support. I don't know if that's going to be the solution, but it's like something they're talking about, I guess.
Yeah, I guess one of the problems is like we're so dependent on our phones to function. Like I think I have like a fantasy of just having like a brick phone again, but actually I need maps and like my cards and just like everything that your phone is there for. Like, maybe you could have two phones, one for like scrolling and social media and like YouTube and all of that, and then one for like practical day-to-day functions. And if there was a way to only allow certain apps on each, then maybe then you don't have your scrolling phone with you the whole time. But I don't know if that's possible to separate out.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk from experience. I actually tried that exact strategy before. So I had a really old phone that I would basically keep in the bedroom and use that from like 9 p.m. onwards. So I try and not be distracted by all the other apps on there, and I just use it for, maybe I was gonna watch, because I often watch kind of longer form things before going to sleep or something. So I would just try and separate the two. And then the phone broke, so I did it for a little bit, and then I stopped because of that. And yeah, I agree. This feels like a very unsolved problem, right? It's gotten so bad. I think, I personally take pride in when I do watch long form content. I think this is good. I'm watching a full movie. I'm not going to look at my phone because I find that interesting, and I can watch it for 90 minutes without looking at my phone. And I think that's great, when actually what I'm doing is still being kind of lazy and not doing anything. But the fact that I'm not scrolling and getting this constant dopamine hit cycle, I feel a bit proud of it. So it's kind of got to that level where I'm rewarding myself with that. I think maybe we should talk a little bit about this Web3 stuff now, right? Because we are nominally a Web3 podcast, and I'm interested, maybe if we just get your starting point. So what do you know about Web3 right now? Because if not, we can talk about it and we can kind of find a middle point. But yeah, have you heard of the term? What do you think about it, if anything?
I know that Alec really likes Web3, and that is all I know. Something about blockchain.
Annie's eyes just like dilate. Like, it's a trap. They've got me.
Something about blockchain, maybe? Bitcoin?
Yeah, that's as good a definition as I've heard, to be honest. I mean, why don't you have a go then, Alec? If you like it so much, apparently, why don't you try and just give the intro to Web3, and we'll go from there.
I mean, we've been doing this for a year and a half now, and we've had like maybe 50 guests try and define it. And what we found is it's pretty tricky to define, and there's not very many good definitions. I think that like this particularly applies because of your social media influencer kind of background. So it's kind of like in the paradigm right now of social media, you're in a lot of ways beholden to, like, say, the Instagram, the TikToks of the world, and like you kind of have to do what they say, right, to kind of monetize or get engagement, all this kind of stuff. And there's a data privacy angle there where they're the gatekeepers to everything. This Web3 paradigm is kind of like an advancement of technology right now, where more kind of onus and ownership is pushed to the individual. So you own your account, you own your data, you take a percentage of the cut of the social media engagements you get. You actually determine maybe how the social media is run. Like, this is kind of like one of the fundamentals is, if you're a participant and you want to say the main contributors to, say, TikTok, like you are, then you actually get a say in how TikTok is run and what the underlying fundamentals of TikTok are. How they do, Jack? Is that okay?
It's lovely. I mean, I think you have hit on the main thing that I would hit, right? I think Web3. So I would define it as kind of, it's this collection of technologies, including blockchain, as you said, and I think Alec and I define it as including AI as well. So all that stuff we mentioned before is also in the conversation, and it's a collection of technologies that are basically trying to improve ownership, improve the ability for people to reap more rewards from what they provide to the world online, basically. So the more you do online, as as a content creator, this obviously will hopefully resonate with you a little bit, but to be able to get more of what you deliver returned to you in value, right? So instead of it being all kind of monetized behind your back, but also beyond the monetization ownership aspects, I think another stream of it is in the thinking is in privacy and security as well. So there are lots of technologies about, how do I maintain better privacy online? How do we reduce the risk of data breaches, for example, by changing how much data is stored where, basically? So I think there are definitely things that apply from both those contexts to the kind of mental health profession. Like you mentioned earlier, the almost doing therapy online and delivering kind of these services online helps some people potentially because it's a bit more abstract. It's like it's talking to a computer is not as scary as talking to someone in person, maybe. And I think that's where maybe some of the security things could help. That I can imagine being able to do things in a more anonymous fashion as well. So not being, even if you want to, a little bit like, I guess, how the Samaritans might work, where you have an anonymous service. But yeah, based on that description, is there anything in there that's resonating? Does it all sound like rubbish to you? I'd be interested to know.
Yeah, loads. Definitely about the algorithms on social media, because as a creator, they are just the bane of my life. They're completely closed, and there's constant rumors and videos about, oh, they've changed the algorithm, and now Instagram is putting out 1-minute videos as opposed to 5-second videos. So then everyone quickly changes how they make their content. And then actually that's not true, or maybe it is true. Or it's happened to me that you'll be growing and growing and growing, and then suddenly something in the algorithm changes, and suddenly your stuff's just not being shown to new people. So something about like having no control and it being dictated by this kind of like anonymous source. So is the idea of Web3 that this is going to change into this like new thing, or it's changing already?
It's fascinating that, because we've already talked about this academically, about social media influencers thinking that that's a neat, like a thing they want. It's actually nice to know that it is something that is true, and you don't want to be beholden to these like AI algorithms and black box that no one knows about. But yeah, that is like a fundamental premise. It's like the idea of kind of decentralized governance is one of the ways it's kind of also described. Like you have these things called DAOs, where it's like the entities that contribute the most to these platforms, they're the ones that also help with the governance. And like the governance is done in quite a transparent way. So there's a project called Blue Sky, which is kind of like a new paradigm for social media, where, if you are on Blue Sky and the Twitter or the Instagram equivalent, and you're generating lots of content, lots of traffic, everyone's looking at you as a content creator, all of a sudden you have a bigger stake in the network. And you kind of think of that as like a percentage control of the network, like a percentage in the company of Blue Sky. So if they're like, we're going to change the algorithm, you get to vote on that potentially and be like, oh no, I don't want to change the algorithm. Or, I actually don't like that the algorithm prioritizes fear and greed. I want an algorithm that prioritizes hope and happiness, because that's what I think is good for the world. And then you get to put your percentage vote towards that. I think it's kind of a lot of it is kind of airy-fairy in a lot of ways, but like there's good examples of DAOs working in practice right now, where the community that is involved in the system is actually the one governing the system, rather than this gatekeeper that is Instagram at the top of everything, ruling them all.
So it's kind of like democracy in a way, because at the moment it's a total dictatorship. Like there's just like a room of people who are deciding who we didn't vote on, how the rules work.
Exactly. That's a good way to describe it. But it's like, it is kind of like democracy. But I guess like, one of the beauties are that you get more involved because you kind of think of it as having accountability and ownership. You feel more attached to it. So it also makes you want to succeed more in that app. But yeah, it's quite a beautiful thing. So are you going to invest in Bitcoin now, like I asked?
I'm invested in Bitcoin.
Are you? Is
Yeah.
this because your partner told you to? Because I told him
Yeah.
to.
Exactly.
And I can't believe you just admitted live on air that you've given financial advice. I would never do anything like that. So that's yeah, I think for me that's always been one of the things that I was most excited about the lofty promise of Web3. And to be clear, it is very much still a promise. I don't think this stuff's been cracked at all, especially on the replacing the algorithms themselves. I think we're a long way off that. Everything is still dominated by the same kind of group of Silicon Valley giants, etc. But the ethos is there, right? It is meant to be making these things more transparent, or replacing them with this kind of people often talk about as decentralized, right, or democratized governance process. So I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. The other thing that I've seen a lot of people talking about in the last year, especially with ChatGPT coming out, and obviously we've touched on this, but I think there's a bit more to talk about here, is on actually using AI in two different contexts. So, you drew the distinction between these earlier, the loneliness kind of epidemic we've got, as well as the delivery of mental health. So maybe we stick with the loneliness one first. I've seen a lot of people positing chatbots as a solution to this epidemic, right? So basically saying whether it's for old people in a nursing home and giving them someone to talk to. I mean, old people have Alexas now in there, so we're kind of already starting that process of having someone they can interact with, but people want to take it a bit further and give them someone that they can just talk to, maybe, even if they know it's a robot underneath the hood. It gives them something to hold on to. So what do you think about that as a prospect? Do you think that is the magic bullet that people are thinking of, or do you think there's issues with that?
It feels very depressing, and I can't say why. I guess it's like, I don't know. I believe sometimes that, like, there's too much advancement. There's too much technology. Like, I just saw a bunch of like Hollywood stars signing something to try to not have a Chat GPT version or like a DALI version
The
of
writer's
cinema.
strike thing, right? They're worried that, like, because a lot of actors right now, they only need like a bit of transcript and them saying a few things in a certain ways,
Yeah.
and they can just CGI their entire career basically and never pay them again. So it's a big fear factor for them.
Exactly, yeah. It's like it's replacing human creativity and art. And in the same way with the retirement home example, it's like there's so many other solutions that don't have to be technology. I saw a really lovely video of, they put a care home and a kindergarten next to each other, and the kids would all go and visit and developed really nice relationships with the old people. It's like an intergenerational thing. Kids love old people love kids. It would light up their face, they loved it. That seems like a really connective human solution to a problem than, you get lots of things in retirement homes where people are sent in to do kind of entertainment and exercise and things like that. What if you just cut all of them and put a robot in all of their rooms? Like, it feels cold, even if the robot is able to provide some sort of connection. I think there's just something like to your core that it's not real. It's like paying for sex, like, yes, you are having the sex, but are you feeling loved, and are you feeling connected and intimate? Like, it might feel good in the moment, but part of you probably knows that it's not quite real. I feel that way about robots replacing human connection. Like, it might tick all of the boxes, but it's like the uncanny valley, like the closer it is to human, the more creepy and weird it is. And like, yeah, it doesn't sit right with me, but I'm up for there being some sort of positive use of it in the therapy space.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of in a similar position on this, right? I have the suspicion that there is practical value to be had from some of this, but the practical value is because it's a way of avoiding solving it by other means, right? It's like the classic, we have the resources to solve world poverty, there's just not the incentives to do so. And I feel like that's the same with lots of things. The loneliness epidemic with the elderly, if you take them as one subset for now, for this example, I feel like adding these chat based robots into the world is a way of practically kind of plugging the hole for a short period of time and helping while there isn't the care they need, or the resources or these other creative solutions. But is it dangerous to then do it, because it means you then keep avoiding the problem, you keep kicking the can down the road a little bit. So yeah, it does smack of quite a dystopian future for me. Yeah, and then you've got the other side of it where people are kind of, as we mentioned, almost wholesale saying we could replace therapy with AI chatbots and all this stuff, which, yeah, to me sounds like a very bad way to go, for the reasons you described earlier, right?
Yeah, I think I would jump in on this and just say, like, it seems like, again, we talked about a short-term solution, but like it's kind of a reflection of failure on humanity. It's like, we can't fill this gap. We'll just plug in a tech solution to do it. And in my mind, I'm like, that's a failure of society. And also on the other side, it's kind of like a bit disrespectful to what humanity is at its core, because you're like, oh, actually, a robot can do this as well. And then you're kind of like, well, what is it to be human if a robot can do all these things that we kind of think is quite core human abilities, to feel, to empathize, to care? Like, if a robot can do that to the point where it actually adds a lot of value, like, well, what is it to be human anymore? Is there any distinction? And I feel like that maybe it creates a bit of friction between, what we think of as our purpose in life. But it's really tricky. Like, it gets really philosophical. This stuff is like, if it solves the problem, why not do it?
Yeah, exactly. But also, it doesn't solve the problem. It's like technological advancement is really useful in areas where we need growth. So, climate change, throw all of the technology at that problem, like, great. But getting things to act like humans have already developed that. We've already had our own evolutionary development to become like the empathetic social creatures that we are. We don't need any help with that. What we need help with is being freed to use those skills ourselves, not having something replace that for us. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes it's just like growth for growth's sake. Like, let's just develop, and then suddenly AI has taken over all of the creative spaces. And like, who wanted that? Why are we doing that? And I think there's no reflection. It's just like growth, 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 growth.
That was a perfect segue on something I wanted to ask you about. So you talked about growth, 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 and like, we can't just growth, growth, growth when we have like limited resources, right, and a limited space and all this kind of stuff on the earth. That's one of the problems of the sustainability crisis we're having right now. We've seen some work, and some people pose the idea that the metaverse and this virtual reality is kind of a solution to that. And because, now we've pushed this idea of capitalism, and growth is absolutely required constantly for the economy and all this kind of stuff and society to grow. But rather than do it in the physical world, we can start to do it in the virtual world, which has less potentially ecological impact on the world. And this is something that I see a lot of people pushing towards. Have you ever thought about, you obviously know about VR, AR, I think we've used VR together maybe, but like, have you ever thought about that in your field, like using it for therapy? You talked about, the screen being quite artificial, and that creates a separation sometimes maybe with clients and therapists, but you also get a bit of security by doing it in your room. Imagine being able to like 3D see someone in this reconstructed world. You're safe in your room, but it also feels slightly more human. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't thought about it, but lots of ideas came into my mind as you were talking. One would be like exposure therapies. So there's an exposure therapy where whatever the person is phobic of, you might, go to the zoo and like together look at a spider and then like feel the fear and process it and then hold the spider and
Yeah.
exposure therapy. And I guess with VR, you could possibly use that as a way of coming against your fear, but knowing that actually it's not real, but it feels so real, so you have all of the emotional triggers. That's one. Another one that I thought of is there's a type of therapy which is called chair work, which is where you put like somebody in your life in an imaginary chair in front of you and have the conversation that you wish you could have with them. So whether this person is dead or alive, or you have a relationship with them or not, you might, finally have the conversation with your father that you never got to have, for example. And you say it to them and imagine that they're sitting in front of you. However, it's a bit it's never quite real because they're not actually in front of you and you're talking to an empty chair, but it is really cathartic to kind of get all of those feelings and thoughts out. With
I
VR,
thought you were saying like putting like an avatar of like someone's dead grandparent
No, no,
in the room. I was like,
no,
this
it's
is
just an empty
dark.
chair. But with VR, you could actually have a conversation with someone, like, and say it
Okay.
to them, and then it might feel like you have, you know?
Yeah.
I
I
feel
get
like
you.
we've covered 3 or 4 different Black Mirror episodes, right? Because
Yeah.
all of these
None of
things
them I
have been,
actually think are healthy, but I'm just trying to think of creative uses for VR.
yeah. So if we do kind of, maybe not looking down Black Mirror, but just to the future in general, we have all these different emerging technologies with Web3 and also the various other fields that are advancing all the time. What do you think we need in the future landscape of technology to support mental health as a profession, as a goal for society? Is there anything you think that would be really great for us to achieve by technological means to kind of support that goal?
Well, I think as we've discussed, a circuit breaker or a cycle breaker for phone addiction or any sort of like scrolling addiction, more than what already exists, something that actually inhibits you from using your phone, like your phone turns off completely or something, just to give people tools to really break the phone addiction. In terms of mental health, I think there are tools that can be used, places that can encourage reflection. For example, you could have a notification like, how do you feel right now? What's going on for you? Stop, breathe. Really basic fundamentals of checking in with yourself and allowing space for feelings. So that could be really helpful. I guess my real like answer to that question is less technology. I think technology is terrible for our mental health. Like, I really want to be on board with finding solutions within technology, but I think technology is the problem. So it's like, yeah, switching it all off and talking to
So not
people,
Neuralink then.
talking to each other. No.
Annie, this is a technology podcast. You're not meant to say that.
Sorry.
I get you. But it's kind of things like the point of technology has been very practical, right? How do I make things faster, better, cheaper, all this kind of stuff, just improve. And I think the understanding and the focus of importance on mental health has only really existed maybe in the last like 10 years, in my mind, 20 years, maybe in the general mindset, like that it's completely popularized and everyone knows the terminology, everyone knows about mental health and all this kind of stuff. So I think that there's kind of like a laggard effect right now where we are going to see technology start to take that into account, hopefully. And we're definitely seeing it from like a governmental regulatory standpoint. But even like mental health services in the UK are nowhere near what the physical health services are. And I hope there will be a change in focus. It seems like we're starting to see like the effects on children that are starting off with, technology from like age 2 and 3. And I imagine there'll be more governmental regulation on this stuff. And that'll affect both us societally, but also the technology as well, that it has to have certain limits, has to have certain restrictions. Like phones now already allow you to track your usage, which was a bit of a game changer. Well, I never thought they'd do that because obviously there's no positive person who's been like, oh, I'm spending 10 hours a day on my phone. Great. Let's try and spend 11 tomorrow. That's only had a negative effect. And I think that has come from the regulatory standpoint. So I am hopeful, but we'll see what happens, right? At the end of the day, a lot of the tech companies care about one thing, and that's profit. So it's tricky to know how it's all going to work together.
Yeah, I think no one stopped to think, oh, how is this actually going to impact us on a psychological level? It was all about, exactly as you said, convenience and making it faster and all of that.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing these consequences. But it almost feels like it's gotten too big that I can't imagine how it will change as fundamentally as it needs to.
Jack,
I was just going to say, we were so busy asking if it could be done. We didn't ask if it should be done. So yeah, this is where we are now.
And then that bombshell. No, that is a good point to end, to be fair. I am hopeful. I think overall technology has done much more for humanity than it has, detrimented. And it is obviously saving so many lives overall. But it's something that I think designers, developers, builders have to be aware of, is the psychological impact of the technology they're developing. And I hope and think more and more we are going to see that. But Annie, thank you so much for joining us. Like, I've learned so much. This has been such an enjoyable and insightful episode. Yeah, we'll link your social accounts, because before I got off Instagram and TikTok and all those things, I was following them all the time, and I felt much better for it. It's some of the hopeful content actually online, some of the few hopeful contents online anyway. And yeah, thank you for joining us wherever you may be, and join us next time to untangle a little more of Web3.